Good evening. My name is Brian Dories. I'm the artistic director of Theater of War Productions, and we are a social impact company that uses theater as a tool for helping communities address pressing public health and social issues. And we're thrilled that you could join us this evening for our online presentation of The Wound Dresser in partnerships with the PBS series Poetry in America and Community Building Artworks. Tonight's program will present live readings from Walt Whitman's poem, The Wound Dresser, which centers on the poet's experience caring for Civil War veterans as a catalyst for powerful guided discussions about the poem's enduring relevance today. The event will also feature clips from Poetry in America's recent episode on The Wound Dresser, as well as live responses from a group of veterans, medical professionals to help frame crucial dialogue between diverse communities about the challenges of healing wounds, both visible and invisible, at this critical moment in our nation's history. And before getting started, I just want to thank the Andrew Mellon Foundation for their support of our digital programming. I'd also like to thank our co-presenter, Poetry in America, a public television series and multi-platform educational initiative that brings poetry into classrooms and living rooms around the world. Special thanks go to Lisa New, creator and director of Poetry in America, and her wonderful staff for their partnership on tonight's event. I'd also like to thank our co-presenter, Community Building Artworks, a nonprofit organization that connects veterans, healthcare professionals, and civilians through workshops led by professional artists who reflect the diversity of the population they serve. Special thanks to Seema Reza, the CEO of Community Building Artworks, and her amazing colleagues for all of their help as well. Finally, I'd just like to acknowledge and thank Theater of War Productions company manager and producer, Marjolaine Goldsmith, who brilliantly transitioned our work to Zoom in May of 2020, and will be conducting tonight's event behind the scenes. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Seema Reza, the poet, essayist, and teacher and nonprofit leader who will be co-facilitating tonight's discussion with me. Seema is going to say a few words about herself and her organization, and then kick it back to me. Over to you, Seema.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here tonight. Like Brian said, I'm the CEO of Community Building Artworks. We got our start in the military healthcare system at Walter Reed in Fort Belvoir, where I learned personally and professionally that community is essential to recovery from both emotional and physical injuries, and that at the heart of community is communication. At the heart of communication is knowing what it is that we contain. And writing and art making are the best tools that I know of for both figuring out what we contain and communicating it to the people around us so that they know why we're weird and feel inspired to tell us and comfortable to tell us why they're weird, and that, I believe, is what community is. So I'm really excited to be here and be a part of this community and this discussion.
Thank you so much, Seema. I really appreciate it. So many beautiful ways your organization overlaps in its values, its mission with ours and with Poetry in America, and what it's been such fun collaborating on this event tonight. Tonight's event is going to unfold in 4 parts. First, Lisa New from Poetry in America will introduce a short series of clips from their recent episode on Walt Whitman's The Wound Dresser. We're going to put the link to that episode in the chat right now, so you have a chance to look at it after tonight's event. She's going to provide some background and context on why Walt Whitman began visiting military hospitals in Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia in the 1860s, and what kind of conditions he found there. After the clips, our 5 readers who have assembled tonight will perform Walt Whitman's poem as a chorus. So to be clear, the singular voice of this poem, although it's refracted in many ways, will be performed by 5 readers who have their own, I think, really impressive and exciting interpretation of the poem for you to hear tonight. Tonight, we're pleased to have 5 wonderful performers with us, including David Strathairn, whom you may know from Nomadland, Jeffrey Wright, you may know from Westworld, Craig Manbauman, who's a poet, a nurse, and a United States Air Force veteran, Major retired Belena Stuart Marquez, who's also a United States Air Force veteran and poet, and Colonel retired Gregory D. Gadson, who, in addition to being a retired colonel from the Army, is also an accomplished actor. You may know him from Battleship. And we're really delighted to have all 5 of these performers and readers here to collaboratively perform Walt Whitman's poem for you tonight. After the reading, we'll have 3 or 4 community panelists who've gathered with us tonight, veterans, frontline nurse, and EMS professional. They're going to respond in a moment from their guts to what they heard and saw in the poem that resonated with them across time, that spoke to them as true, And following the panelists' brief opening remarks, our readers are going to respond to what they heard that was true tonight in their own reading and what drew them to the text. And then we're going to open things up to the audience for what we hope will be a lively, healing, constructive discussion. During the discussion, we'll ask questions, Seema and I, about the wound dresser and how it resonates with you all tonight. And if you'd like to respond to one of our questions, we just ask that you use the raise your hand function, the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen on Zoom to indicate you have something to say. For each question, we'll call upon a number of people who raise their hands and promote them to the screen for the duration of their remarks. Tonight's event will be captioned in English, so if you'd like to see the captions, we ask that you all activate the captions now at the bottom of your screen. You can adjust the size of the captions when you do that. This is still new territory for us. More than 62 performances on Zoom in since the pandemic began. We've performed for hundreds of thousands of people from more than 100 countries all over the world. A new way of performing, a new way of communicating, but we apologize in advance for the fact that we're not going to get to everyone who raised their hands. And there will likely be glitches and technical issues during the event, but that's fine with us. To be clear, we're not after polish. Our hope is to invite you into this messy and live space with us where we'll make mistakes and we'll recover from them. By getting messy and making mistakes and then adapting and moving on from them, we hope to be modeling for you as an audience what we hope you'll do during the discussion, which is the main event, when people take the risk of sharing their truths and their interpretations and their perspectives and not sounding brilliant or polished in order to be present in the moment with each other, even in isolation, without judgment and with shared vulnerability. That's what makes us human, and it's the only way out of this mess. So without further ado, I am delighted to turn things over to Lisa New, host and creator of Poetry in America, who's going to introduce herself, her organization, and the clips that we're about to see from the recent episode from Poetry in America on the wound dresser. Lisa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm Elisa New. I am the director and the host of Poetry in America, which is a multi-platform initiative, as Brian said, whose mission is to bring poetry and the arts into classrooms and living rooms and marvelous Zoom amphitheaters of the kind we are gathered in now. It is a very great pleasure for me to be able to partner with Theater of War and with community building artworks on this important event. Brian and Marjolaine and I began talking about doing this event way back in 2020, which somehow during this pandemic seems like eons ago. When I was trying to get a season 3 episode of Poetry in America focused on Whitman's great poem, The Wound Dresser, trying to get that off the ground. I knew that that episode would include, among its interpreters, 2 physicians, a playwright, Tony Kushner, an opera composer, a young opera star, and an historian. I was looking for an actor. Brian and I had gotten to know each other a bit. I was looking for an actor with intelligence and compassion and a great deal of soul who could give voice, really literally, in the episode to Whitman and could interpret him on screen. And I had David Strathairn in mind. And Brian introduced me to David, and on a very hot summer day, filming very, very far apart in the middle of COVID, we began this work together. The audience for the television episode of The Wound Dresser was always intended to be a general one, a television audience, but as with everything Poetry in America does, we hoped that the episode would find its place in classrooms and in community settings, and especially as part of events like this one that brings frontline healthcare workers and military veterans, and I guess the rest of us in this mess, as Brian put it, all together. The episode, The Wound Dresser, that opens season 3 is itself rich in interpretations, but the excerpts I'm about to play for you set the scene for this evening without venturing any interpretations. Instead, we leave those to all of you. So I think we can now roll the clip.
He would have read about war in the newspapers, but he would not yet have seen it face to face. I believe the first time he really confronted the horror of war himself was when he went to look for his brother at Fredericksburg, late in 1862. He comes across this pile of amputated limbs that remains this vivid image in his mind.
His brother's wounds were minor, but this glimpse of the war convinced Whitman to stay near the front. In Washington, working as a civil servant, Whitman went every day to the military hospitals, where he witnessed the work of doctors and nurses, dispensed gifts to patients, and comforted the sick and dying.
This was pre-antisepsis, this was pre-antibiotics, and so infection was almost inevitable.
A surgeon might stand and operate on 24 patients in a row and never wash his hands. So the spread of disease was unstoppable.
I should also say that Whitman himself was probably at risk in there. There are people dying of more than war injuries. In fact, many more people died of typhus and typhoid and cholera than they did of their wounds.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lisa, for setting up that clip and for sharing your work with us. Obviously, Zoom is not the ideal environment for playback of episodes. So if people want to see the full episode, they can simply click on the link provided, hopefully after our event tonight, to go deeper into the experience. What I'm struck with just watching it is that it really not only sets the stage for the reading that's about to take place, but also the stakes of what's happening, in those hospitals. And for Whitman himself, who first went to the hospitals because of his brother, but ultimately discovered something there that caused him to keep going back, even at great personal risk. And that level of stakes, I think, speaks to the present moment. It speaks to the stakes that many of our veterans have faced, but also our healthcare professionals who'll be part of this discussion tonight. And with those heightened stakes, keeping those in mind, we're going to turn things over to our incredible group of readers who are now going to lead us through their interpretation as a group of Walt Whitman's poem, The Wound Dresser.
The Wound Dresser.
1.
An old man bending, I come among new faces, years looking backwards, resuming in answer to children.
Come, tell us, old man.
As from young men and maidens that love me. Aroused and angry, I thought I'd beat the alarm and urge relentless war, but soon my fingers failed me. My face drooped and I resigned myself to sit by the wounded and soothe them, or silently watch the dead.
Years hence of these scenes, of these furious passions, these chances of unsurpassed heroes.
Was one side so brave? The other was equally brave.
Now, be witness again. Paint the mightiest armies of earth, of those armies so rapid, so wondrous. What saw you to tell us?
What stays with you latest and deepest?
Of curious panics, of hard-fought engagements of sieges tremendous. What deepest remains?
2.
O maidens and young men I love and that love me, what you ask of my days, those the strangest and sudden your talking recalls. Soldier, alert! I arrive after a long march, covered with sweat and dust. In the nick of time I come, plunge in the fight, loudly shout in the rush of successful charge, enter the captured works, yet lo, like a swift running river, they fade, pass, and are gone, they fade. I dwell not on soldiers' perils or soldiers' joys. Both I remember well, many of the hardships, few of the joys, yet I was content.
But in silence, in dreams' projections, while the world of gain and appearance and mirth goes on, so soon what is over, forgotten, and waves wash the imprints off the sand.
With hinged knees, returning, I enter the doors. While for you up there, whoever you are, follow without noise and be brave of heart.
Bearing the bandages, water and sponge, straight and swift to my wounded I go, where they lie on the ground after the battle brought in, where their priceless blood reddens the grass, the ground, or to the rows of the hospital tent, or under the roofed hospital, to the long rows of cots up and down each side I return. To each and all, one after another, I draw near. Not one do I miss.
An attendant follows holding a tray. He carries a refuse pail, soon to be filled with clotted rags and blood, emptied and filled again. I onward go. I stop.
With hinged knees and steady hands to dress wounds, I am firm with each. The pangs are sharp, yet unavoidable. One turns to me, his appealing eyes. Poor boy. I never knew you. Yet I think I could not refuse this moment to die for you, if that would save you.
3.
On I go. Open doors of time, open hospital doors. The crushed head I dress.
Poor crazed hand, tear not the bandage away.
The neck of the cavalryman with the bullet through and through I examine. Hard the breathing rattles, quite glazed already the eye, yet life struggles hard.
Come, sweet death, be persuaded, O beautiful death. In mercy, come quickly.
From the stump of the arm, the amputated hand, I undo the clotted lint, remove the slough, wash away the matter and blood. Back on his pillow, the soldier bends with curved neck and side falling head. His eyes are closed, his face is pale. He dares not look on the bloody stump and has yet looked on it.
I dress a wound in the side, deep, deep, but a day or two more, for see the frame all wasted and sinking, and the yellow-blue countenance, see. I dress the perforated shoulder, the foot with the bullet wound, cleanse the one with a gnawing and putrid gangrene, so sickening, so offensive, while the attendant stands behind, beside me, holding the tray and pail.
I'm faithful and I do not give out. The fractured thigh, the knee, the wound in the abdomen. These and more I dress with impassive hand, yet deep in my breast a fire, a burning flame.
4.
Thus in silence, in dreams' projections, returning, resuming.
I thread my way through the hospitals. The hurt and the wounded I pacify with soothing hand.
I sit by the restless all the dark night.
Some are so young. Some suffer
so much. I recall the experiences sweet and sad.
Many a soldier's loving arms about this neck have crossed and rested. Many a soldier's kiss dwells on these bitter lips.
Thank you all so much. I know if we were in a live space, you'd have uproarious applause in recognition for your amazing interpretation of Walt Whitman's poem. All you have is me and my immense gratitude. It's been such fun working on this with you and being in dialogue about these lines and why they resonate with you. And I'm excited for you all to share that with our audience. But before we get to that, first of all, I want to thank you all again. And secondly, we're going to invite our panelists up to join us, and Seema Reza, my co-facilitator as well. Seema's coming up, and Amy, Eli, Diana, and Raina. Feel free to activate your video and come join us. And as you all are joining us, I just want to plant the first seed of the first question that we're going to ask you as an audience. As you listen to these panelists respond from their hearts and their guts, and then you listen to our readers respond to them. And readers, anytime you want to jump in, you're the real facilitators of this conversation tonight, so please don't be shy. What we'd love for you as an audience to think about and come ready to talk about is, in spite of the fact that this poem was written in the 1860s, and in spite of the distance of time that separates us from the end of the Civil War, and some might argue that we're standing on the precipice of a new Civil War. What spoke to you across time? What resonated with you? What touched you? What was true? For an audience, we'd love for you to think about that and also include the comments you're going to hear in that resonance. And then we'll come to you after we've heard from our panelists and readers. But as I mentioned to the panelists, I'm just going to add, in the early days, when we used to do this live and physical, we'd look to see who was making the best eye contact to see who gets to go first, but we can't really do that on Zoom. So I just have to feel the vibes across the universe. And if you don't mind, Diana, I'm going to go to you first and have you introduce yourself and then launch directly into your gut response to what you heard in this poem.
My pleasure. What a great thing to get to be here tonight and to be part of this. I love these events and I love the spontaneity of it. And as a result, I'm trying not to be too nervous. I'm going to be spontaneous. I am a paramedic in northern Vermont. I live in a very rural place and have been working on an ambulance for the last several years. I got my start in EMS in the 80s though, back when we didn't wash our hands. And so just the comments that we were making at the beginning about sanitation and hygiene and things like that. I remember jumping into the back of an ambulance as a volunteer and plunging my hand into the neck of somebody who had been partially decapitated by a truck. And I didn't have gloves on. And that kind of set the stage in my own head of what I was going to be hearing about tonight. And so each time that they were, the readers were describing specific details of the wounds, it's like I could create in my own head without any trouble at all, a similar memory of a similar experience. It's like, yeah, I've seen that wound. Oh yeah, I know about that. I know what that's like. And it made it seem really real. I'm sure Walt Whitman really saw these things that he was describing because you don't make those kinds of things up. Some of the lines that stood out to me was like, both sides were equally brave. And I think he meant probably both sides of the people fighting in the war, but I took it to also mean like the carers and the people who needed the care. Both sides there are equally brave because it takes bravery to provide that level of comfort and all that. The world goes on, waves, imprints in the sand. So it's like, no matter how things are, you always kind of get fresh and again, and the slate gets wiped clean. And sometimes that comes only with death. That comes sweet death part. And then I guess the final comment I have is about the attendant, because I thought that was really interesting that the attendant was there. And I don't know, it kind of speaks to the hierarchy of care that we've got so many levels of people taking care of people and people taking care of the caretakers, taking care of the people. And I like that illustration of the different levels of care.
Thanks so much, Diane. I really appreciate all of those comments. You connect on so many levels to things that we talked about in rehearsal, but also blowing this conversation wide open with that interpretation of was one side so brave, the other equally brave. One immediately goes to thinking about the Civil War, but then you draw us right into the room where Walt Whitman is standing, or into the ambulance where you work, and that tension becomes all the more resonant and powerful hearing you say it. Thank you so much for kicking us off. I really appreciate it, and can't wait to hear from you again, Diana. It's great to see you. Eli, do you mind going next? You're next on the screen to me, going across it.
Sure, I'll do my best here. So I served as a combat medic in the US Army. I enlisted just after 9/11. I served a tour in Iraq during the first year of the war. I served at Walter Reed shortly after that during the surge in Iraq, taking care of troops downrange in Iraq and then stateside here back at home. And that duality always created a huge conflict and contributed a lot, I think, to my own burnout and trauma. And I was not able to continue working in EMS after a few years of that work, and especially at Walter Reed. I think the thing that jumped out at me the most was this line: a refuse pail filled with clotted rags and blood, emptied and filled again. And just this cyclical nature of this, that the rags just keep getting bloodied and we just keep trying to clean them and they just keep coming back, and I think that was one of the things that I struggled the most with, is like every time we would discharge a patient, somebody even more fucked up would end up in their bed, and it just felt like this thing was never going to end. And it's like I hear and I read and I even try to write war poetry like this, and there's been always this thing that gets to me, that like poets have this tendency to romanticize war. And I feel like if if Whitman and if all of these poets had a tendency to be a little bit more graphic and a little bit more honest, maybe it would somehow serve for us to learn a thing or two, and maybe finally decide to relinquish these addictions that we have to this horrific drama that humanity has been insistent on playing out every few years for millennia, and I always have trouble, especially the older the poetry is. I mean, Whitman, I try to understand his words, and there's a lot of it that is very archaic to me, and yet there's this strong sense of familiarity. As Diana said, I too have seen and cared for so many of these specific wounds that he talks about, and it's like, this was over a century ago. How have we not learned anything since? Why am I, as a young medic in the early 2000s, still taking care of the same horrific injuries that Whitman was taking care of in the Civil War? And I have to be honest, that it makes me lose a lot of hope, and it makes me fucking angry that we haven't learned anything. And they talk about it in the series MASH with meatball surgery, right? This disgusting field surgery that we just have to do our best to patch people up in a short time frame with the limited supplies that we have, and send them on to the next echelon of care so that we can just replace them with the next mangled body. And there seems to be this hopelessness in that, to me, that I've always struggled with ever since then. And to give Whitman credit, at least he was able to put it in poems. I mean, I've sat in countless writing workshops with Seema and some of these other folks here, and I have never been able to actually sit down and write about the specific experience. I've always hidden behind all of these other, metaphors and romantic language around the thing, and have never been able to just depict it in its graphic honesty. And so I guess that's mostly what I took away from it, and I will shut up and let some other folks chime in. But those are some of the things that stood out to me the most.
Thank you so much, Eli. I really appreciate it. I think, one of the things with all of our work that we've done with military audiences, with ancient or archaic poetry, which we've been up to for about 13 years, that things resonate and that they connect across time, generating outrage and even rage itself is something we've seen with medical professionals, with military, with those who've lived these experiences. And I think there's a utility to that, hearing that named and hearing you acknowledge it. I would also flip it on its head and also say, though, through modern medicine and battle medicine, we've created the conditions to save lives at a scale that, no one could possibly have imagined in the 19th century. And yet that has resulted in 30, 40,000 people from the recent wars on our side who would have died from their wounds, who live on with complex injuries, not just of physical injuries, but of the spirit and the mind. And we've created a kind of permanent subclass of people who are neither well nor sick, but stranded on these sort of islands of chronic illness. And we haven't advanced psychologically to address their needs as quickly as we've advanced in terms of the science. And so I really appreciate you bringing that outrage into the room and also your own experience. And also I just wanted to sort of, riff on that for a second, and hopefully other people will weave into it. Greg, I saw you nodding quite a bit. I didn't even have to see, we were having total mind meld right there. I knew you wanted to respond. So Greg, if you don't mind unmuting yourself first, because you were muted. Over to you.
Yes. So one of the common questions that I've gotten since I was wounded was, how long did it take you to heal? How long was your recovery? And they're looking for a number, and in my mind, I want to say I had my legs for fucking 41 years. How quick am I supposed to recover? And so that's sort of the huge chasm of understanding. Everybody wants to put a bow. The public, our society, they want to put a bow on this and pack it in neat, like it's all over. And then the second question is the VA treating you well? Again, they want to defer that sense of responsibility, that sense of guilt, that sense of whatever is on their mind. They want to pass it on to something else. They want to put it behind. But we don't ever get to put it behind. I mean, I'm living a great life. I'm not complaining, but at the same time, every day I get out of my bed, every day I get in the shower, is a reminder of the cost. And I'm blessed because I'm here. And there are a whole lot, as we know, that didn't make it. So thank you, Eli and Dinah, for your thoughts and perspectives. They've truthfully given me permission to kind of come out of my shell a little bit. So thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Greg, do you mind reading the first few lines of the wound dresser again, having said that?
Yeah. So I was drawn to this as we were rehearsing. An old man bending, I come among new faces, years looking backwards, resuming in answer to children. Come tell us, old man, as from young men and maidens that love me. So when I went to war this time in Iraq, this was like my fourth gunfight, you know? And so it starts to get kind of old. I mean, almost like the medical professionals that it's just relentless. It doesn't stop. And everybody is just sort of just kind of going there in their own worlds. I mean, or earlier this week, I'm talking about like, you know, Putin is going to go into the Ukraine, and everybody it's just sort of like, no big deal, nothing. No one is giving a hoot about it. And I'm not saying no one is, but I just sort of generically, it just feels like just a normal day. And this thing isn't going to turn out well.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Greg, for taking the chance when I said to read that. It really illustrated something for me, hearing you, that chord that you strike between your own experience and Whitman's, drawing us closer to something truthful behind both. You know, when the United States put out the sort of statistic that they projected, the intelligence community projected, and the military projected 50,000 civilian deaths in Ukraine if there was and untold wounded. It's like, how do you even, if you haven't experienced those things, how do you internalize what that means?
Right. And it's just like a number. You know, I'm sorry. I'm just, another thought about this cost, you know, this lives and the wounded. You know, our leaders, our politicians, whatever you want to, you know, they talk about these numbers like they're just sort of finite. What's the cost of war? Well, in my mind, we're still paying for World War II. As long as there's a veteran or dependent of a World War II veteran alive, we are still paying for WW2. And I'm even talking about Korea and Vietnam and all these other little skirmishes. We all on this call will not see the bill for what we just fought and come through. None of us are going to live long enough to see that bill come final. And we just sort of cavalierly accept these numbers like they're just like we're playing dominoes or Monopoly or something. All right.
Thank you so much, Greg. I appreciate it so much. And this is the kind of discussion, cross discussion that I was hoping. So I appreciate you modeling it for us. But Amy, you've been very patient, and we definitely want to hear from you as one of our panelists. So over to you, Amy.
Thank you so much. First, before I say anything, so this affected me very much. I'll do the best I can. Thank you to our amazing actors and to all of our military people that are here. And as somebody who's comes from a military family, my brothers and my father, but I've never served myself. We appreciate you, even though sometimes I think it doesn't feel that way. So I'm a nurse practitioner. My specialty is emergency medicine. My focus is sexual assault forensic examination. So I take care of people who've been sexually assaulted, as well as our ER patients of all kinds. So I've been doing this for a long time. I'm not young. This pandemic is obviously something that we never thought we'd see. And I think you become sort of, depending on where you work, desensitized to certain things. I always try to be patient-centered and caring, but sometimes volume and just life, and we are human. And so those having to be in a traumatic situation all the time. Now, of course, I'm preaching to the choir, as you've all been in way more traumatic situations than I have, but that's kind of relative. You become desensitized. And so sometimes if you're not from the culture of, say, the emergency department, you may not understand that the senses of humor are a little weird. Maybe we find humor and things that people go, oh, why would you find that funny? It's most of it as coping. So I'm super pleased to be here and hear this. And I didn't think that I was going to have this reaction. These are the things that resonated with me, and particularly pertaining to the last 2 years. So he says, my face drooped and I resigned myself. And I remember every shift that I had to work, going in the morning of before my 12 hours, 13 hours, and I would stand in front of the door because it was so hard to walk over the threshold, even though I never regretted becoming a nurse and a nurse practitioner. And I love saving lives, and I love handing somebody socks if that's what's important to them. I love giving somebody a meal or any of the things that I can do to make them well. It was so hard to walk in. And I kept saying, I don't want to hate what I do because I love what I do. But it was so difficult to walk over that door and start doing it all over again. Because it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Patients sitting in chairs because we didn't have enough beds. And I live and work in New York City. This is by no stretch of the imagination a rural area. We're not underserved. We have a lot of resources. That being said, we were figuring out how to split vents between dying patients. We were trying to figure out just ways to get oxygen out of tanks that were running on empty. We were discharging patients home that we knew were probably going to die. And that's not why I became a nurse. I became a nurse to be able to save lives. So to knowingly hand somebody who's so scared paperwork and say, you just have to go home now because I don't have any more chairs left, was the antithesis of why I went into healthcare. So that was very difficult. The attendant passing, I think, resonated with me as well. And I thought of it a little bit in a different way. I remember having to, as we were coding people, you couldn't finish the code with one patient when you had to be pulled to the next code because there wasn't enough time and we didn't have enough staff to have one per bay. So you couldn't even finish the work. So the attendants would come and try and wrap up the patient's bodies and get all their stuff out of the way because we needed to clear the bay for the next person. So that resonated with me. And then the last thing was actually from the beautiful clip, and I cannot wait to watch the rest. They said that he went to give gifts and comfort to the sick and dying. And one of the things that was the hardest for us to deal with was that all of these patients were dying alone. And there was no one because their families weren't allowed in. So we had to be their family. We had to hold a lot of hands. And we had to tell people, it's okay. I know you're tired. So before they die. And we didn't know them. But it was just as hard. And then came the next wave and we were losing staff members and we were coding our own staff members. And I've never been to war. I imagine this is somewhat what it's like. Less bullets. But it was something I'll never forget. And it's in my amygdala. It's there, it's stored. And even as I try and move on and we try and find the joy and do all the things that are important to humans, that little drawer of your amygdala always opens and there's something that comes out. This resonated with me very deeply. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Amy. I really appreciate everything you shared. I feel like that's the poetry goes past the forebrain straight to the amygdala, and there's a directness to it that makes it more potent than journalism or documentary or any other form. And you really spoke to that and what it brought up in you. I just want to acknowledge, we've been listening to a lot of stories of medical professionals over the last 20 months with our project, Theater of War Frontline, and that something resonated with you, and listening to someone experiencing medicine in the 19th century and feeling like it described your experience of being helpless and unable to actually live up to the standards of care that you were trained to execute and uphold. That deviation from standards of care that's so central to the identity of medical professionals. And I know from so many people who've spoken in our events, feels like a moral failing. I do think there's a connection there between what those who've experienced war and those who've experienced the pandemic. There's a connection to be made. We now use words like moral injury, moral distress, soul wounds. And we know that sense of betraying one's own standards or one's own beliefs or values is the wound that cuts the deepest. And I imagine Whitman got a healthy dose of that. And perhaps that was part of what inspired him to write in such graphic detail. But that particular line that resonated with me as I was listening to you, where he says, "Poor boy, I never knew you, yet I think I could not refuse this moment to die for you if that would save you." I get the sense that so many nurses, especially nurses, the 4 million nurses in our country who are most overexposed of all healthcare professionals during this pandemic and underappreciated, were in that position of actually dying for their patients. And so I really appreciate everything you brought into the room, and I can't wait to hear more. But I wondered, Craig, if you wanted to respond to something you heard, or maybe read the attendant section again, having heard Amy. Again, don't feel pressure from me. I just felt like it might resonate with you. Craig, if you don't mind me saying, just finished nursing school. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to reach out to him.
Yeah, it's as I listened to you, Amy, and Diana, and Eli, what came to mind was kind of a lot of frustration, a frustration with this fundamental tragedy of conflict, of whether that conflict be war, whether that conflict be a pandemic, is that it brings out both the best we have to offer, but the worst that we have to endure. War is the genius of technology from years behind us, and the genius of so many smart individuals, but for the purpose of killing. And in the hospitals, we have these great ability to save lives, but it's undercut by people who live in bubbles and don't ever have to get their hands dirty. There's this, I don't know who said this, but this concept that violence terminates at the most vulnerable. So I always ask the question, from whom did the violence that we down here endure? Who started it? Who pressed the button? Who pressed the red button to send the missile? Who is causing the fucking climate change that's leading to the destruction of our environment, that's likely to lead to more viruses? Who are these people that live in bubbles that destroy our environment, destroy our social infrastructure, but never get touched? And we all have to endure and create moments and amphitheaters and virtual spaces like this to have discussions. And how do we send this message to them? Where's the stop point? Where's the end point?
I just want to respond to that quickly. I used to say, and we would joke, obviously it was a joke, but I would say, I wish when we would hear people saying, this isn't real, it's made up, the numbers you hear are fake. I would say, why can't we do tours of the ER right now? I would love to line those people up and say, come on in, let's have a tour. I don't know this guy, but I just finished putting a tube down his throat, might get untubed, probably will die. Let's take a tour behind the hospital where we've got 2 refrigerated tractor trailers for the bodies because there wasn't enough space in the morgue to keep the dead. That's what I wanted to do. Not in a real way, but again, kind of in a real way. and it was hurtful. Just as I see when people bash or dismiss people who are in the military and like, well, that's what they signed up for. They died. That's what they lost. They lost limbs. They lost pieces of their soul. They lost their sanity. That's what they signed up for. That's not the truth. That is what you have put as your truth, but that is not a truth. And it certainly doesn't pertain to individuals as their truth. And so I'm flabbergasted when you said they live in their bubble, this created bubble that they have where the world is amazing. And trust me, I am fortunate. I am so fortunate. I get to listen to these amazing, talented people do theater, and I get to educate, and I get to, do all these things. And yet people say stuff that I'm like, how can you be so stupid? I don't understand. It's a choice. It's not natural. It's a choice. You choose to be there in that bubble. You choose not to see the suffering of others. There's just no empathy, and it's crazy.
Thank you so much, Amy. I really appreciate it. It looks like you've lit up the board with a couple of our other participants. So I know, Eli, your hand went up first, and I promise, Raymond, we'll get to you soon. But Eli had his hand up, and we'll go to him first.
Yeah, I think what Amy just said is so spot on. When I was working at Walter Reed, taking care of patients, there was during the height of the controversy around the fact that they were banning any photography of the caskets being offloaded at Andrews Air Force Base. And, the war dead were not seen by America. And when we would take in new patients, Walter Reed's busloads would come in the middle of the night between 2 and 4 in the morning, and they would bring them in under the cover of darkness when people wouldn't see them, when the citizens of Washington, D.C. could not see the cost of war. They could not see the convoys of the wounded and the dead coming home. And when this pandemic started and they were banning photography from the emergency rooms, and when I live in New York City and was here during the first wave, and the morgue trucks were stacking bodies literally in one on top of another, trailers next to each other. My partner had a morgue truck parked in a vacant lot right outside her apartment building next to a funeral home, and there were rotting bodies in U-Haul trucks parked on sidewalks. I mean, it was fucking horrendous, and there was no media showing us the cost of this. And we wonder how so many people somehow could, as Amy mentioned, could have the audacity to think and believe, or to say that these numbers are inflated and that, it's not really that big of a cost. I mean, how long have we been doing this, right? I mean, we learned this in one war, and now we're fighting another here on our homeland and against this virus, and we are hiding from it and denying it as it's right in our faces. And the parallel between what we're seeing now with this pandemic and what, I mean, frankly, I would say troops like Amy on the front lines of this war are enduring is not unlike what we have seen in wars past. And we have continually hidden the true cost of war from ourselves, from our fellow citizens, from our nation, and from our children who need to see it the most.
Thank you so much, Eli. I get the sense that Whitman, who was a journalist and also wrote journalistically about his time in the hospitals, made a decision to include this poem in Leaves of Grass, his poetry that kept accruing over the span of his life, because there's journalism is something that you consume. It's a medium that you consume. So we read about these morgue trucks. We read about the casualties or the potential casualties of war, but we consume it, or we consume it in our entertainment. But maybe it's the medium that ultimately is the problem, that we need media that can deliver. And that's what I hear in Amy's sort of inspired idea. Of course, we can't bring people into the ER in the height of a pandemic, but would that we could, so they could see the bodies and understand the consequences of their behavior. And that's something we've heard from so many people in the medical profession. I've heard it from people in war. I would say, because we've done a lot of work in corrections, would that we could bring everyone into a supermax prison facility, federal facility or state facility, because it would change their relationship to those institutions in such a fundamental way. Thank you so much, Diana. And again, Raina, we'll come to you next, but Diana had her hand up to respond. And Belena, I'm going to wrap back around after we go to Raina, because I want to make sure we get to Raina. Okay. Diana,
the last several comments just made me think of the importance of witnessing. Eyewitness firsthand information sharing is really what seems to be the answer to the problems with people living in bubbles, the problem with journalists trying to tell somebody else's story. The firsthand people with the eyewitness accounts have to tell their own story. But then, like Eli said in the beginning, you can hardly even bring yourself to do it. And yet it's the only thing that is going to enlighten people who haven't actually been there themselves.
Thank you so much, Diana. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And obviously we're trying to model that here tonight. So the more first person perspectives, the closer in proximity to the issue we're trying to address, the more we have to learn from the person speaking. That's the value at the center of Theater of War Productions work. And I know our other partners as well. Raina, last but not least of our panelists, I promise, I also apologize for any miscommunication tonight. You're such a sport to jump right in, but I presume you get the gist of what we're doing. If you could introduce yourself and respond from your heart and your gut to what you heard that spoke to you tonight, over to you.
Hello, I'm Raina. I am a transgender veteran. I served in the Navy in the early 2010s. I was at Walter Reed for about 1.5 years, recovering from an injury. And it's funny the way things work out, because now I'm a robotics engineer making medical equipment. One thing that I wanted to say immediately was, Amy, when you started talking, you said, oh, obviously my trauma is not like you guys, but I think it's very important that what is traumatic to us is traumatic, and you can't compare traumas. And I'm sorry, I'm gathering my thoughts.
Take it down.
I've just been in a lot of places where someone says, oh, I can't complain because da da da. But I'm like, yes, you can complain if it's important to you, if it's important to your life. That impacts you in a way that other people don't get to judge that until you know it didn't. Sorry, that was kind of a tangent.
No, it's beautiful. Please.
But the part in the poem that I came in a little bit late, unfortunately. But the part in the poem that I really stood out to me was, I thread my way through the hospitals, the hurt, the wounded, I pacify with soothing hands. I sit by the restless all the dark night. And that stood out to me because when I was at Walter Reed, a little side tangent again, I'm sorry. So at Walter Reed, you have these two barracks. There was the physically wounded, amputees, people with mobility issues. When this big, bright, brand new building that they had just finished a couple of years earlier, and then kind of shunted off to the side in this building that was built like way back in the 50s, brick and mortar, no insulation. You had a lot of the less visibly injured people. And at night, you would hear people just yelling, crying from the patios and from your window, hear people having night terrors. And sometimes it feels like the only thing you can do is just go and offer words and just be there for people. And you're just thinking to yourself, like, why? It just felt like they were very like, we're going to put you in a box over here where you're out of the way, where we don't see you. And it's hard because we have to help each other, because nobody's going to come and do anything for you, really. And you're just sitting there with your fellow people who have trauma, and all you can do is just sit there by them. And you want to do something so bad. Like, I wish I had the words to make this better. I wish I knew what to say to you right now. But you can't, and you don't. Like, there are no words. Nothing you say or do is going to make it better. But you can just physically be in that space with them. And it's just, as he threads his way through the hospital, just pacifying with a soothing hand. Like, sometimes you just need a hand on your shoulder. Because there's nothing else you can do.
Thank you so much, Raina. I really appreciate that. This poem focuses on physical wounds in a really graphic and direct way, but it's so important to give voice to what often are invisible wounds. And I think this current cohort of veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, especially over the last 20-something years, have advanced that cause more than any generation prior. I mean, obviously Vietnam set the stage. Please,
hey Brian, just a point about what you just said about the invisible wounds. He describes, to me, he is talking about the wounds of the veterans, the visible wounds of the veterans, but the invisible wounds of those taking care of them clearly resound, and that's sort of what brings it sort of full circle, or closes the loop on how devastating this endeavor, this thing called war.
Or as Raina, I think, threads, I think really beautifully, the invisible wounds of being a fellow patient and listening to the suffering of those, the invisible wounds be expressed and not be able to do anything, which is another layer.
The line.
Yeah, please. I don't know who's speaking. Oh, David. Sorry. Yeah.
I mean, there you guys are talking to that line, which is parenthetical, when he says, "These and more I dress with impassive hand, yet deep in my breast a fire, a burning flame." So there's that inner trauma of the caregiver at the same time as witnessing the external burning wounds and flames of those he is taking care of. It's great you picked that up. That shared trauma, which you talk about, Raina, that one's trauma is their own, but it is all of our trauma in this kind of experience.
Thank you so much. I know, Belena, you've been waiting for some time. I hope you still have something to say, but over to you.
Yes, it actually ties in with what Raina and David and Greg have had to say in recognizing trauma and owning it, and trying to find some way to understand and connect it. And that you mentioned that Whitman included this poem in Leaves of Grass. And the first line of Leaves of Grass, or the first stanza, I'll say, I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me is good as belongs to you. And so that inclusion of who he is and who you are also encompasses this trauma, because once you have it, it doesn't leave you. It's a part of you. And if you understand it, there's a connection there, even if it's not the exact same trauma. Just like in this poem, depending on your frame of reference, whether you are a combat veteran, whether you are a veteran on the front lines of healthcare, whether you are someone who has experienced trauma in your personal life, being able to look at these words through that lens and see the connection and see either the moments that are a great struggle, or the moments where people reach out, or where he himself reached out, and where you stand in that. Who are you in this poem? Where are you represented in this poem?
We've seen that a lot in our work. You know, it's adaptive and totally natural, and we hear it all the time. And I know, you know, veterans say it all the time, that no one can understand my trauma. No one can understand except for the people who were to my left and right in the exact place where this thing happened. Totally reasonable response. But when we engage in forums like this, and you hear the overlapping sort of concentric circles, the communities of trauma that are overlapping, one comes right back to the insight you brought into the room, Belena, which is, no, we don't understand the material circumstances of each other's trauma, but we can understand the sense of isolation. We can understand what it means to feel betrayed. We can understand what it means to be set apart from the community, housed in a different building. You know, these are things that there are infinite numbers of roads to those experiences. And I get the sense, by putting them into this poetic form, Whitman is bringing us into sort of consciousness that we do contain all of these things within us. Jeffrey, I see your hand, and usually we don't let the actors speak, but Jeffrey is one of our exceptions, as is David, and we're delighted to have them both here with us. Jeffrey, over to you.
Well, that's why I had the mute button on at the beginning. I was so unused to speaking. Thanks, Brian, and thank you everyone for the conversation. And I don't really have anything back to one of your original points, Brian, that is really insightful. I really just have a question, and it's born of both the poem, but also some of what I've heard tonight. The poem, it seems, is an attempt to shine light into the shadows of the consequences of war. And what I've heard a number of times tonight are stories about the ways in which we try to hide the trauma of war for the purpose of facilitating war, that those who have moral injury might be pushed aside into the shadows so that they can't be seen. The ways in which we talk about not discussing or not showing the wounded or the dead as they return home, so they cannot be seen, so that we can, those in those authorities, the powers that be, can continue the war effort, so as not to undermine the public's faith in the war effort. We hide these traumas away. And when I'm hearing this relative to the pandemic, when I'm hearing about the desire from our nurse on the front line that cameras be let into the ER so that people can't reject the fact of this pandemic and the consequences on the citizens, their fellow citizens, I ask myself, we've all seen it, the misinformation, the disinformation, the denial of fact relative to the pandemic. And I ask myself what the purpose of that is. and that's really my question, is why are we willing to hide that trauma as individuals or as a collective, or deny the reality of it? Is it to facilitate the success of the next virus? Is it to be unprepared for the next outbreak? It's just something that I'm wrestling with. We do it as individuals, hide our trauma, and ultimately, perhaps often it explodes. We hide the trauma of war and the consequences of war, and the next one explodes. So it's just, again, not an observation, but just a question. What is the purpose of the denial that I've heard spoken of tonight relative to the pandemic and this thing that we've all experienced, but some of us pretend not to have?
This is what we meant by saying that you all are co-facilitators, and it's a terrific question, which I'm going to let float because I know someone will pick it up. And before Seema, we go out to the larger audience. We brought up an audience member who's also been with us as a panelist before, and I know I want to go to him really quickly before we restate the question. That's Anthony Almojera. Anthony, I know you've been to Egypt and back in the last month or so. It's great to see you and wearing your uniform. But maybe you want to respond both to what you've heard and also maybe to Jeffrey's question. Maybe you don't, but over to you.
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here and to listen to all of you read such a poignant poem for the times is really something. I'm listening to everybody speak, and of course I can relate. I'm a paramedic for the fire department. I'm at work now. I'm listening to the calls come over the radio as you guys are talking. The COVID calls coming over. So it's real. It's very real. And I just want to say something to Amy real quick because I hear it in her voice and I have the same voice. You can't hate something unless you loved it or have loved it. So try and remember the base of the hate is love. I hate war because I love humanity. So it's something that it's a thin thread to hold on to, but you kind of do have to hold on to it. Otherwise, we're never going to make it, because I hate being a paramedic at the moment because I loved it so much. And it feels like it let me down. There's so many things to respond to, but I don't understand. And to speak to Jeffrey's point, we're on a rock floating through space. We're all just making it up. How come we make up so much suffering? And it's not found anywhere else in nature. Nature has this balance, but we choose to go against that and make up so much suffering. And because we make it up, I think we have shame about it. So we want to hide it. I think there's a lot of shame based in the failures as a species and what we're doing on this planet, which we don't know, 50 miles left or right, we would have been Mars or Venus, right? We're just making this up. And some of us make up really cool things and some of us make up suffering. And I think there's so much shame involved with letting a pandemic foster or sending people to war, especially proxy wars, or sending paramedics into the front line without N95 mask or a chance to eat a meal, as I'm thankful Jeffrey was able to provide for us. I think it's shame-based. I think we carry sin. Maybe that was the sin that we're born with, and maybe there needs to be a mass baptismal to wash away that shame, the sin of shame, not the sin of committing the act, because it can always be forgiveness for that. It could always be understanding and growth, but I think the sin of carrying shame. And once we get away from that, then we can have a dialogue and truly grow. And I'm looking at the poem in verse 3, the second verse the second paragraph in verse 3, from the stump of the arm, the amputated hand, I undo the clotted lint, et cetera, et cetera. But at the second one, I dress a wound in the side, deep, deep. Deep, deep is that shame. I'm dressing that. I'm trying to paper over it. But a day or two more for the frame, all wasted and sinking in the yellow-blue countenance I see. As a medic in New York City, I've had my fair share of amputations. The amputation happens for various reasons. But what I see is the mind becomes amputated at the same time. The shame of, how did I get myself into this? Why I feel duped? Why was I sent to a war? Or why was I selling drugs? Or why didn't I make the left in the car instead of the right? Why wasn't I wearing my seatbelt? Why did I sit in a tub thinking I was going to kill myself? That's my own personal experience. Why do we carry that shame? right? So as a medic, I'm fortunate because I see the amputation, I get to focus on that, and it becomes muscle memory. Pack the wound. But the memory of the amputated mind, there's no way to kind of pack that. There's no way to there's no balm, there's no way to really pull that apart. And maybe until we figure out how to deal with the shame of it all, that's our burden to carry. We're not supposed to get rid of it. We're not supposed to not try and understand others and their experiences. We have to be in it, be a part of it. And I think the dream is to walk a middle path, but that's impossible at the moment. So we're gonna have to live in the extremes until we all learn to really, truly love each other and let that shame go. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I appreciate you taking on Jeffrey's question. It's a hard one. I hear you saying we hide these wounds and create the conditions for more of them out of shame for having created them in the first place. That almost makes sense to me with regard to why people would act against their own self-interest and the interests of the people in their own community that they rely upon or are connected with. I see Amy and I saw Craig's hand go up. Amy, let's go to you, and then Asima, you'll rephrase the question. We'll go to Eileen, and Craig will come back to you in just a second, but I want to get to some audience members as well. But Amy, I wanted to make sure we got your response.
Thank you so much. I think, kind of to answer a little bit of that is my experience with dealing with all these sexual assault patients, and something that I have a lot of conversations with them about to make them understand when they have come in with shame because they were sexually assaulted. It's because we as a society socialize, especially young girls, to take the onus of if somebody is going to hurt us because we were dressed in a certain way or walked a certain place or, did something. And I'm not saying that men don't get sexually assaulted because 50% of my patients are male. But I think that we socialize our children to take the onus for what somebody else is going to do to us. And how is that possible? How can you possibly control what somebody else is going to do to you? So when you put the onus on somebody else, you can shame them. You can, you can say, well, that happened to you. You're saying you had COVID, you saying you got raped, but well, why were you there? What, but nobody does that for anything else, right? If you're carjacked, nobody says, were you driving a Mercedes? Why would you drive such an expensive car, right? Nobody would shame you for that. But when it comes to our own person, the onus is that well, if somebody hurts you, it must have been something you did to them, right? Or tantalize them with, or, and if that's true, then why do I have elderly patients with dementia getting sexually assaulted? It doesn't make any sense. So I think that the shame can be a little bit on us as a humanity to perpetuate that socialization of each other. And we need to talk about these things. We need to talk about war and the damage that it does inside, not just the physical, but to our economy, to our people, to the people next to us, and become human again. And I think that humanity, when I see it, I'm so excited if somebody smiles or says hello. And I think that's a sad commentary, right? I think we should be smiling more. We should be saying, Raina, you look beautiful tonight. I think you look so nice. I'm glad you joined us. And that is from my heart, but we don't do that. We're not socialized that way. And it doesn't make any sense.
Thank you, Raina. You look beautiful tonight. And I'm so glad you joined us. And I'm really pleased that you're here with us. And I just want to say, what I hear you talking about is gaslighting, which is seemingly the most universal strategy. It's we go to it as a kind of, we all at some level go to it as a way of deferring our own feelings of shame or guilt by placing it upon someone else and putting the agency and onus on them of the suffering that we've caused. Thank you so much, Amy. I really appreciate it. Seema, I know we've had some other hands up, but Seema is going to do something instrumental at this point because we only have 40 minutes left. We want to hear from some audience members, although we've had a wide-ranging, amazing conversation, which will continue amongst those on the screen. So Craig, I remember you had your hand up. But Seema's going to restate our question that we're asking audience members, and then we're finally going to go to Eileen, who's been waiting patiently, our first true audience member.
What a brilliant discussion. I think also part of what we struggle with and why we want an answer like it's not real is that we want certainty. We're really uncomfortable with uncertainty, with not knowing what to do. Like scientists are always so nuanced. They're not going to just be like, this is the thing to do. And interpreting a poem is also about like living in that uncertainty, right? I always say 90% of my job is undoing whatever English teachers do to us around like our right to respond. And what we're asking here is what resonated with you, inviting people to look at what Amy called opening the drawer of the amygdala. So what about tonight's discussion or the performance or the poem resonated with you the most?
Thanks so much, Seema. Over to you, Eileen, if you don't mind unmuting yourself and launching directly into your response.
Good
Oh, we lost you, Eileen.
evening, everyone. Okay, hopefully my internet will stay steady enough for me to speak. My name is a clinician from St. Louis, Missouri, originally from New York City, and I work as an art therapist. And actually, I've been finding a lot of parallels, and wondering like what, in reference to Jeffrey's work in Angels in America, what the HIV pandemic in the 80s has taught us about facing many of the challenges and uncertainties that we have now. That's what's been coming up for me, especially since there's been so much creative work happening, shedding light on the movement with Refuse and Resist in order to gain traction and awareness, and how the theater was impacted heavily as a lot of the LGBT community lived and worked in the theater district, and sex workers. And I'm deeply moved and troubled also by the points that everyone has brought up, being that I lost my own father to COVID in April of 2020. And to have people, accuse, the media of lying when I see tents in Central Park, it's just like abhorrent. And so I really feel for Amy and Anthony over in New York, where my brother still lives. And I've talked to veterans over the phone when I used to work for the crisis line for several years. And I can't even imagine what my colleagues at the crisis line must be facing right now in terms of handling people's anxieties. And I currently moved on to working with refugees and the mounting tension with the Ukrainian border and how that's impacted, other countries close by, like in Bosnia and Afghanistan and Palestine, has been heartbreaking. So I'm very appreciative of all of you coming together to present Whitman's The Wounded Dresser. And it's very appreciative to be able to share this space with you, and just curious about your thoughts regarding, yes, the AIDS epidemic and how that may have impacted your life as a healthcare worker or as a veteran or just as an American or an artist. And how do you think that can teach us about the future that is to come from this pandemic.
Thank you so much, Eileen. I really appreciate your question. Others have brought up the HIV/AIDS epidemic in other performances we've done. And we've had medical professionals who trained at, for instance, Bellevue at the height of the HIV/AIDS describe the conditions there in similar terms to what Whitman describes in the poem, in terms of bodies, and the inability to help them, and the helplessness of looking on. What I hear in your question, I think, and I'll let other people respond, is, there's this line about the wash the imprints off the sand, the impermanence of our memory, our institutional memory, our cultural memory of things that are actually in the not so distant past that could have prepared us for the present moment. What's the half-life of those memories? And can we reach back only into the 80s and find strength or find utility in what was learned during that period? And there are many other analogous things one could say about things that are very recent that may help us in the present moment, though some of the imprints have already been washed away. So I'll let that float unless someone wants to respond directly to Eileen, because just in the service of continuing, let's go to Margie. Jeffrey, please. Yeah. And then we'll go
well, since she mentioned me, I'll just make an observation very quickly, if I could. It was my experience in working on that play on Angels of America at the time, and just kind of being in the midst of that, even though we were still late in the early phase of the AIDS epidemic then. But my impression was that there was a sense of unity. There was a sense of collective understanding of the threat. And there was a sense of gathering among those who were vulnerable, and an acceptance of the threat. And there was collective action taken. Now, I don't want to oversimplify and say that there weren't factions among, within the gay community at that time, and differences of opinion about how to address, the threat of HIV. But there was a sense of unity that we haven't found, and it goes back to Whitman's poem to some degree around, coming out of the Civil War. There has not been that sense of unity, at least in America, around the threat of COVID. It was an observation made, I think it was by Peter Navarro, who was heads up, or I think still the WHO's global response to COVID, and also had done so in West Africa on behalf of the WHO and its response to Ebola. And he said something that I thought was really insightful very early on, is that countries who were most effective in containing COVID at the beginning, Vietnam, Taiwan, for example, were countries that had a sense of collective responsibility among its citizenry, and that there was a sense of unity that bound them, and that was the one individual aspect that allowed them greater success than other countries, such as the United States. And it wasn't the technology, it wasn't anything related to healthcare necessarily, but the thing that was most critical was a sense of unity against this common threat. So I think if there, from my kind of distant perspective, if there was a difference in the response to AIDS, at least among the gay community, of course, at the time, relative to the response among all of us who are under threat from this, it's that the lack of unity, going back to this idea that we're on the precipice of, or in the midst of some type of strange, civil war, whether it's a civil war propaganda, or whether it's a hot fight. We're in the midst of this disunion that's undermining us and undermining our capacity to really protect us individuals and protect ourselves as collective.
I'd love to just jump in.
Yeah, please.
Briefly in answer to Eileen, and it's making me think of something that Eli said about moving between two different worlds, maybe a world that's safer and a world that's not safe, and how one gets over living an intensely painful, overstimulating, meaning saturated, and maybe the meaning is that we're all sinners, or maybe the meaning is that war is necessary. But that transition seems to me one where that those of you who are on the front lines are probably experiencing all the time, but that as a whole culture, we will probably face. And I thought of this because of a television episode I made last season about the AIDS epidemic with the poet Mark Doty. I'll say very briefly, the poet Mark Doty, the problem of this poem is that the poet he's survived AIDS, his partner has died 20 years since, and he goes and he needs a haircut. He just wants to look good. He wants to go get his hair cut, and he gets in the barber chair and he feels guilty. He basically feels guilty for just the ordinary pleasure of wanting to look good. And in the course of the poem, the barber chair descends into hell. He circles his way into hell, where he meets all of those he has lost. And then he comes up on the other side. And what I thought of, Eileen, when you raised the AIDS epidemic, and Eli, when you talked about that discontinuity between worlds, is this very real phenomenon that there are these extreme periods in some people's lives and in some cultures' lives, and how we get over that, how we give up the stimulation, how we give up the horrific, I think Eli used the phrase, a horrific drama on the other side. Some people never, I gather, get over that. That was my 2 cents.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I imagine we could keep dropping in episodes of Poetry in America every few minutes.
I just did.
Mark Doty is one, and then of course there's one coming up we'll reference toward the end that's coming up on Friday. But thank you so much for making those connections. Margie, you've been waiting for some time, and then after Margie, we have Brett, I believe, after Margie. Margie, over to you.
Hi. This has been so powerful for me, the discussion, much more so even than the poem. So thank you, first off. And I will do full disclosure. I'm not a trauma worker. I'm not a first line worker. I'm not a veteran. The closest I've come is I volunteered and then later worked in the psychiatric hospitals. And I agree with whoever had said, I think it was Raina, about the presence. Sometimes just your presence, you may not have the expertise or the clinical insight at the moment, but you're being there in a supportive way, a loving way is felt. And there's so many things people have said that I related to about AIDS. My closest friend from college died of AIDS because it was back when ACT was the only game in town. But I absolutely agree with Jeff that there was a real unity and uprising of advocacy that has not been obvious in this pandemic. And I inadvertently ended up watching a webinar from the people I consider completely crazy, the anti-vaxxers, conspiracy theorists, one of whom was a nurse, probably Amy's familiar, I don't remember her name, who went undercover and said that in New York, there were no overcrowded hospitals. It was all a hoax. And, and then I heard something about, there's a theory about birds aren't real, that they've all been replaced with surveillance drones. To me, these people are just out there, and I do not have the compassion that people say I should have for them. I do not have the understanding. To this day, I live in Washington, D.C., and if I see a white guy with a scraggly beard, I get nervous.
Well, then I guess I better get off the stream then.
No, you don't count. you know, January 6th was way too close to home in very many ways. And then another thing that struck me, I think it was Eli who said, have we learned nothing from Vietnam? That was my immediate response when we went into Iraq. You know, Afghanistan, I didn't feel good about, but I understood where it came from. But Iraq, I just said, have we learned nothing from Vietnam? We go into these countries to convert them under the guise of, you know, helping and promoting democracy. And it's such bullshit. And there's so much damage that's done in the name of that. And then the last thing I want to say is whoever spoke to the issue of blaming the victim in sexual assaults. I was on my first jury duty many years ago. I was stunned when this young woman who had been raped was being grilled by my fellow jurors. And they were saying things like, why were you at Union Station at 2 a.m? Why were you wearing a revealing dress? And I gave them what for, and I got into a lot of trouble. There was a whole lot of backlash about, how dare you criticize us for grilling the victim. So, I mean, that was, I don't know how many years ago, but I absolutely see that attitude or culture is still alive and thriving. But I really appreciate this forum, this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Margie. I really appreciate it. I see your hand, Anthony, but I want to go to Brett because I know he wants to talk. But also to acknowledge that, you know, last year we were proud because we created a tent big enough to hold AOC tweeting about our work, and also Republican mayor giving Theater of War Productions an honor in a town that voted 72% for Trump. And I think one of the questions that was asked at the beginning of the conversation is like, how do we impress upon people the realities that maybe they deny? And I think one of the answers to that question is creating a tent big enough that we can all stand together and hear each other. So I appreciate everything you brought, Margie, into the room. And I know, Brett, you're going to speak next, and I see Anthony's hand, and I think Amy and Christian are next. But as a fellow person with a beard, I want to respect your ability to speak as well. Over to you, Brett.
All right. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to say thank you very much for inviting me in, and to Colonel, if you're out there somewhere, thank you very much for your service. I'm a 21-year vet myself. Eli, I'm a combat medic as well, served in Solder City on the first wave, so I'm sure you know about that. Raina, thank you for your service, and I hope all is doing well. To the panelists, thank you very much for having me. I would just like to start this whole thing. I'm going to go ahead and get back to Walt Whitman. I'm a veteran. I'm going to go ahead and try to steer away from that because I thought the Walt Whitman thing was very fascinating. I love poetry. But I would like to start off by saying the soul is dyed with the color of its thoughts, right? That's kind of a perspective thing, I think, for all of us, right? As Americans, human beings, right? That's Marcus Aurelius for Meditations. I would recommend to all of you to read that just to kind of get a sense of that. I loved the way Walt Whitman described it. Eli, you had mentioned earlier about the romanticism of the war. I get that. Right, we are, I'm looking at the time when I look at the poem. So I'm trying to devolving back to the poem. I'm trying to move it back to the poem itself and the time and the era that they're living in. As a combat medic and some of the experiences that I experienced, and of course mine are going to be completely different from anybody else's. Yours is different from my experience. Colonel, yours is different from my experience. But as a medic and treating those who are wounded, treating those who are alive, and keeping them alive, and some did pass away, unfortunately. And I will share this, and I normally wouldn't share this, but I think it's kind of pertinent to all the paramedics and to all our medical personnel out there. The most intimate moment, and of course I don't mean in a sexual way, of course, right? I got to preface that, being the white guy with the scraggly beard. You know, I had a young soldier die in my arms. Had to remove his gear while he was still sweating, right? And so there's an intimacy that goes along with this. And so when we talk about that silent, you know, walking through the field hospitals, the smells, the tastes, the visuals, the hearing, and I don't know, Now, I suppose maybe Walt Whitman was probably romanticizing it. Looking at back in the time, that war was kind of a new thing, right? Both sides had their belief systems and they were fighting honorably. I just thought it was interesting because I don't think those change, right? It didn't change for me. You know, the smells of Sadr City, the smells of Iraq, Afghanistan. I served in Afghanistan as well. So I think those are things that are very important in a way that in his own way and in his time describing, you know, the senses of war. It's human nature, unfortunately. That's how we are. That's how we're built, I think. That's why I kind of resolve back to the stoicism part of my life that's helped me, you know, my own thoughts, words, and actions are the only things I can control. I can't allow any external issues to kind of hold me back on that because I can't control that thought, right? I can't control what other people are doing. The field hospitals, Colonel, I think you were mentioning the field hospitals in one of your readings. That, you know, I've walked through that. I've taken a civilian through a civilian or a medical field hospital, and just the panic, the sheer chaos of it all. I think those are things that Walt Whitman, I think, was trying to describe in his best, what he knew. And he was not even a civilian, and the medicine at that time, right? I mean, we're not even talking about people who had the type of TC3 training that I used to teach combat medics as they would go out into the field to be able to treat these wounds. So I think that war, the nature of war, and us describing it in the way that he does, I think it gives it justice. I don't think he's trying to romanticize it as much. But I think what he was trying to do was at least try to give it a sense of reality for the time period of what was happening at that time. I love the thought of the young. War is a young man's game, unfortunately, right? The young men of our generation were the ones that are going to be the ones who are going to carry that burden. And that's just the nature of it. But we are volunteers, right? Less than 1% or 0.5% of the population, Colonel, to your point. That's why I think it's in a bubble. Not many civilians understand that reality. And that's kind of subject to us. That's our perspective. And I'm okay with that. And I can deal with that. I had some very traumatic issues with Iraq and Afghanistan, and but I dealt with them through the therapies and through the poetry workshops with Laura. She's out there somewhere. Diana, I see you there. Diana, how are you doing? Very good. Moving on. I know I want to be brief. There was one other thing that I wanted to talk about. When soldiers volunteer, remember, we're a volunteer force in the United States. And I think that's a very important part to understand. Look, I have my own belief system. I'm still very patriotic. I still believe in the United States. And when you volunteer, you know, you do have an understanding of what the possibility of what you're doing is. It can be dangerous, right? There is that possibility. You know, I joined right after 9/11, Eli, same as you. So I appreciate that. And there was, you know, I can't, talk about anybody else's experiences as to why they joined and what they go through, and everybody's perspective is different. But I thought Whitman did a very good job of at the time understanding both sides. It is horrific, right? That's the failure of humanity if we have to go to war. I understand that, but I also understand that from Whitman's point of view, and at that time period, what the country was going through, it was probably necessary, right? So I just thought that Whitman did a really great job. And Jeffrey and David, thank you very much for all that you've done. I've enjoyed your work throughout the course of your careers. But I just want to remind everyone that we are still, we're going to be okay. We can have some differences, and I don't want to devolve into politics, because that's kind of where we were headed, and I don't want to do that. But we're going to be okay. But remember, it's your own thoughts and words as action, folks. Your own thoughts, words, and actions, right? That will determine how we're going to act towards each other. We can't rely on others to decide for us. We can decide on our own how we're going to act towards each other. And I think Whitman did a wonderful job of trying to describe the best he knew how at the time that he was living to get that civil war and blood and the smells and things like that. and bringing it in so we can have an understanding that it's a traumatic thing and we shouldn't be dealing with it. But it's part of us. I hate to say this, right? Colonel, I think you would probably somewhat agree to this. It is the nature of man. This is our thing. Unfortunately, for right or wrong. I don't agree with it, but we volunteer. There's honor involved in this, and sometimes, and that goes away with war. And one last point, soldiers, when they join, and I cannot speak for Eli, Raina, or I cannot speak for the Colonel, of course, but I remember joining for honor, right? Patriotism for the country. And then, of course, when you get down to when I was doing my thing there on the ground, you end up fighting for the person right next to you. And that's really what it really always boils down to. And I have a sense that those boys, even back in the Civil War, at that point, that's what they were feeling at that point. So thank you very much, panel. It's been an enjoyable discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. I really appreciate you bringing us back to the poem. And I appreciate you bringing your experiences into the room as a way of threading the needle of how we might continue to talk about the poem in the fleeting time that we have left. And you have lit up the board, and would that we had another 3 hours. You know, the first time we did a performance of Theater of War, our signature project for 400 Marines, we scheduled a 45-minute discussion. The discussion lasted 3.5 hours, and we are not going to do that tonight. We're not going to go 3.5 hours. Someday these will be endurance events and people can just stay up all night. But I think there are a lot of people who a lot of people, there are a lot of things you opened up that I think people would respond to. And I see that Greg Gadson has his hand up, and of course Belena and Anthony. Greg, over to you. Yeah.
Okay, Brian, and I'll be brief. Brett, great analysis and really sort of great description of sort of the contemporary views, and I just want to echo a couple of them. You really. So the volunteer part, you know, our military and our country has been proud that the volunteer force has sustained. It hasn't fallen apart. But what I would also, my recognition, having a couple of uncles that were drafted, is broken the accountability of these wars with our American public. Look, when you got kids going that don't want to go, and their parents don't want them to go, all of a sudden there's a much higher level of scrutiny and accountability that comes to mind when these young men and women are coming home, and they're coming home maimed. And so these wars have essentially kind of operated in the background.
Colonel, I would agree with you 100%, and I'm taking it from my point of view. I retired as a sergeant first class, the platoon sergeant. So I was in charge of taking a 55-man platoon out to the fields.
Oh, by the way, look, guys, the sergeant first class is the backbone of our professional armed forces. Look, without men like Brett, we do not do as well. We don't function. We don't do as well. I'm telling you, these are the guys that I leaned on, not lieutenants, not captains, but the sergeants first class. So
thank you, Colonel. I appreciate that sentiment very much. I try to instill, and I think and again, I want to be brief because I don't want to take up time from other people. I'm so sorry. It's just important. I think I was raised, and maybe it was just, and again, it's an individual choice. And that's what I love about our country, right? I joined for my reason. I didn't join for Eli's reason. I didn't join for Raina's reason, whatever reason that may be. My reason was I had thought, right or wrong, as it turns out, you know, it could have been wrong. And even if it was wrong, I was willing to, because the country asked me to do it. They needed people to do it. I did it. That's it. That's why we do the paramedic. Diana, right? We've talked many times. I've listened to all the paramedics. I'm sorry. There was another, what was her name? Amy, I think. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Amy the nurse, yeah.
look, we do that for a reason. And I had my cause to do it. And you're right, Colonel. Look, folks make decisions, but I can't control that. I only know the reason that I joined and the reason that I wanted to go through what I went through. And it turned out to be the greatest and worst experience of my life. That's what I always try to tell people. It was horrible and great at the exact same time. And I just think that's something that we need to remember, folks. We're the greatest country on the planet. We don't have to be this divisive. It doesn't have to work this way. We can decide that. We can talk to each other, not trying to prove we're right or wrong on a situation. Discuss it. That's how we get to where we need to be.
Thank you so much, Brad. I really appreciate that. In the spirit of the fact that we have 10 minutes left and there are about 5 hands, I'm going to move and I'm going to go to our audience member first, if you don't mind, Belena and Anthony, because you guys have had a chance. But Christian, I know you've been waiting for some time, and Amy, you've been waiting for some time. So Christian, over to you. And thank you, Brad, for everything you put in. But Christian, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself and launching into your gut response to what you heard in the wound dresser that resonated with you.
Thank you. I've watched several of these, and this is the first one I've been moved to speak at because something stood out to me so much in the poem, and then it was kind of talked about in different ways and just tied together really beautifully. The line from the poem that stood out to me was, I think initially mentioned by David, these and more I dress with impassive hand, yet deep in my breast a fire, a burning flame. And I think David had initially described it as like the burning being a wound, the wound of the caregiver perhaps. And my interpretation was, I've felt that fire, that flame as a rage. And I feel it as this rage at the situation that I've been put in. I'm a family medicine resident, and I've been doing my entire training so far during the pandemic. And it kind of touches on what I think Anthony had said about how you can't hate something unless you've loved it. And I appreciate that tie into love. And I feel like rage is the desire to protect that which we love. And I love people and I love humanity. And so when I feel this rage at the situations that I'm put in and the people that I take care of, I think about something that Craig had said about, who is pushing the button, who is causing these things to occur, whether it's the pandemic and the patient who's coding that I have to go and see, or it's the person with lung cancer who is being sold cigarettes that are giving them the lung cancer, or it's the person dying of heart disease that I'm taking care of in the clinic who can't eat healthy food because it's not available to them. And I feel like it also ties into something that Craig had also said about the bubble. And I think the bubble is a shield, really, that stops us from acknowledging weakness. And I think that weakness is something else that allows us to, or the fear of being weak is something that allows us to make so much suffering and then hide it away. Kind of to the question that Jeffrey had said, that we have this weakness, this inherent vulnerability inside of all of us, and we don't want to face it. We want to hide it. We want to push it away. And so the violence comes out on the most vulnerable, those who can't shield themselves. And then we hide them away to hide that vulnerability that we all share. And I feel like the last thing I'll say is just like, I come away from these events with so much hope, because I feel like some of the people in this room have maybe seen the vulnerability or the weakness, or they've experienced it or they've lived it, and they're here because they want to start trying to talk about it. And I'm so appreciative for that. And I'm so appreciative for all the people who've been fighting whatever battle they've been fighting, or facing what they're facing, and are trying to do something differently. And I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Christian. Thanks for coming to our events, and thanks for what you brought. It's great to have so many perspectives of people who are right in the front of all this right now, and so how present it is for you. I can tell hearing you say it. So I really appreciate you bringing that to the room, and I wish we had more time to keep riffing on what you just said, but I want to leave room for Amy and then some of the other people up at the top, Belena and Anthony and Diana and Craig, and maybe David if we get back to him. But Amy, over to you. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you very much. In listening to everyone, but especially in listening to Walt Whitman's poem and reading Walt Whitman, it's impossible not to think about what Drew Gilpin Faust called her book, The Republic of Suffering.
and not to think about what Frederick Law Olmsted was writing about when he wrote that letter or diary entry, I think it was, watching the wounded from the Civil War being loaded onto hospital ships and how they called out to each other to encourage each other. And that was what Frederick Law Olmsted was astounded by, that there was this kind of republic of suffering. And I think what we're talking about here today, whether I'm a 66-year-old journalist. I've never been to war. I've written about war. I've never been an EMT. I've written about EMTs. I've written about death and suffering. I've been on cancer wards. I've been in mental hospitals as a patient and as a journalist. I've been to republics of suffering. I think we all have. What's magical about Whitman in that poem is how he stitches all of that together. He's walking down those halls. He's walking from bed to bed. Like Raina, he is a witness to suffering, his own, but most importantly and most movingly, the suffering of these young men. And I think what gives me hope is listening to people's experiences and realizing that we are witnesses to humanity. That is what Whitman was doing in being a witness to suffering. We suffer and we die alone. There's no getting out of that. But we are there to be part of humanity through our suffering and through our dying. And if that's how we can achieve any kind of peace or grace or redemption, then that ultimately is our salvation as human beings. And all of this has reminded me of all of Whitman, and it reminds me at a very hopeless time for all of us that therein, in reading people like that and listening to people like you, that I'm okay tonight. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you so much, Amy. That really sums it up. People say, where's the hope in tragedy, all the texts you perform that are so dark. And I think the hope is in the community that comes together to bear witness to its truth. That we're capable of doing this, and that even through technology like this, enabled to do it in ways maybe we haven't been before. I see there's a ton of hands, and there's no way we're going to get to them. And I'm sorry to do this, but I actually want to hear the poem again.
Cool.
So could we do that and let that speak for everybody, and then we'll wrap up with just a couple of pieces of housekeeping. I'm putting the actors and readers on the spot because they may not have their scripts out. But as soon as you're ready, Craig, if you wouldn't mind leading us off.
It's a file. I gotta open it back up.
Let us
Greg,
know when you're good.
Yeah, Greg, just give me a thumbs up when you're ready.
I think it's really cool how I think maybe everyone's comments can be integrated into how we're reading this now at the end of the discussion. I'll just say, well, we're getting files pulled up and stuff. I think that's going to be a really neat effect. I'm excited to see it on the recording.
Presuming Greg can bring it back up.
I'll also vamp while Greg's trying to find that.
Go right ahead, Jeffrey. You're
as a precursor to this, is that maybe there's an answer. One answer to the question that I raised is that it serves the interests of some to keep us ignorant, and that it's about power. And so, Brian, I want to thank you for doing these, for shining light on spaces that some might like to keep dark. And so in reading this poem, we continue in that tradition that you've started here. So thank you.
Beautiful introduction.
I'm good. I'm good.
And Greg is good. So Craig, over to you. Let's let Whitman have the last word tonight.
The wound dresser.
1.
An old man bending, I come among new faces. years looking backward, resuming in answer to children.
Come, tell us, old man.
As from young men and maidens that love me. Aroused and angry, I thought to beat the alarm and urge relentless war. But soon my fingers failed me. My face drooped and I resigned myself to sit by the wounded and soothe them or silently watch the dead.
Years hence of these scenes, of these furious passions, these chances of unsurpassed heroes.
Was one side so brave, the other was equally brave.
Now be witness again. Paint the mightiest armies of earth, of those armies so rapid, so wondrous. What saw you to tell us?
What stays with you, latest and deepest?
Curious panics of hard-fought engagements or sieges tremendous. What deepest remains?
2.
O maidens and young men that I love and that love me, what you ask of my days, those the strangest and sudden your talking recalls. Soldier alert, I arrive after a long march covered with sweat and dust. In the nick of time I come, plunge in the fight, loudly shout in the rush of successful charge, enter the captured works. Yet lo, like a swift river, they fade, pass, and are gone. They fade. I dwell not on soldiers' perils or soldiers' joys. Both I remember well, many of the hardships, few of the joys. Yet I was content.
But in silence, in dreams' projections, while the world of gain and appearance and mirth goes on, so soon what is over, forgotten, and waves wash the imprints off the sand.
With hinged knees, returning, I enter the doors. While for you up there, whoever you are, follow without noise and be strong of heart.
Bearing the bandages, water, and sponge, straight and swift to my wounded I go, where they lie on the ground after the battle brought in, where their priceless blood reddens the grass, the ground, or to the rows of the hospital tent, or under the roofed hospital, to the long rows of cots up and down each side I return, to each and all, one after another I draw near, not one do I miss.
An attendant follows, holding a tray. He carries a refuse pail, soon to be filled with clotted rags and blood, emptied and filled again. I onward go. I stop.
With hinged knees and steady hands to dress wounds. I am firm with each. The pangs are sharp, yet unavoidable. One turns to me, his appealing eyes. Poor boy. I never knew you, yet I think I could not refuse this moment to die for you if that would save you.
3.
On I go. Open doors of time, open hospital doors. The crushed head I dress.
Poor crazed hand, tear not the bandage away.
Neck of the cavalryman with the bullet through and through I examine. Hard the breathing rattles. Quite glazed already the eye, yet life struggles hard.
Come, sweet death. Be persuaded, O beautiful death. In mercy, come quickly.
From the stump of the arm, the amputated hand, I undo the clotted lint, remove the slough. wash off the matter and blood. But on his pillow, the soldier bends with curved neck and side falling head. His eyes are closed. His face is pale. He dares not look on the bloody stump and has not yet looked on it.
I dress a wound in the side, deep, deep. But a day or two more, for see the frame all wasted and sinking, and the yellow-blue countenance, see. I dress the perforated shoulder, the foot with the bullet wound, cleanse the one with a gnawing and putrid gangrene, so sickening, so offensive, while the attendant stands behind, beside me, holding the tray and pail.
I am faithful, and I do not give out. The fractured thigh, the knee, the wound in the abdomen, these and more I dress with impassive hand. Yet deep in my breast, a fire, a burning flame.
4.
Thus in silence, in dreams, projections, returning, resuming.
I thread my way through the hospitals. The hurt and the wounded I pacify with soothing hand.
I sit by the restless all the dark night.
Some are so young.
Some suffer
so much.
so much. I recall the experience sweet and sad.
Many a soldier's loving arms about this neck have crossed and rested. Many a soldier's kiss dwells on these bearded lips.
Beautiful. Well, if we were all together, I know there would be uproarious applause for all of you, but all you have is me. And we're over our time, so I'm just going to take a moment to say that usually we look for someone to have the last word. We're going to let Whitman have the last word, but all in that last word, we hear refracted, I heard refracted all of the comments of all the people who spoke tonight. And there were at least 30 other hands up that we didn't get to, and we apologize to them. We're going to invite you to our next performance in just a second, which is called The Nurse Antigone, which is our next and newest project by and for nurses in dialogue with the general public on March 17th. Premiering on Zoom. We'll come back to that in a second. Before we do, I just want to thank our amazing readers and performers for their contributions tonight, our incredible panelists for their contributions tonight, those who joined us on screen and those who didn't, and of course our partners, Poetry in America and Lisa New in particular, and Community Building Artworks, Seema Reza and her staff and colleagues. It's been an absolute honor collaborating with you all, and such an exciting new form that we found tonight, exploring this poem. We could have obviously gone for another 4 hours. We're going to stop now, but with the benediction that we offer at the end of all of our projects, which is simply this: if you relate to anything that's been said in this space, you're not alone in this room, virtually, across the world. You're not alone across the country and the world, as evidenced by this conversation we started, but by no means finished. And you are not alone across time, which can also be a source of comfort, and it can also be a source of affliction and rage, as was voiced by some of our speakers tonight. Whether this poem is as relevant to the next war, which I hope there isn't one, of course, and or to the next epidemic, I think does wholly rest on what happens when we leave this space. And so I hope this conversation radiates out of the space and into your places of work and worship and into your homes, and affects others in ways that it's affected us. And hopefully Whitman's poem can continue. We also want to direct you back to the wound dresser episode. We put the link in the chat, and on Friday, a new episode is going to drop that will speak to the legacy and the problem of slavery, and a tension that's not mentioned, although present in the poem, and we didn't get to tonight. And maybe we should dedicate another event to that at some point. I just want to say also, if you didn't get to talk or you wanted to be part of this conversation, we don't see these events as mutually exclusive of one another. It's all one conversation, as was evidenced tonight, bringing together medical professionals and veterans and concerned citizens. So we hope in all earnestness, you will join us for the Nurse Antigone, which will be a performance of the full text of Antigone with a chorus of frontline nurses embodying the people of Thebes on March 17th. We just dropped that link for registration into the Zoom, and we hope you'll register, and we'll be announcing it formally next week. But until then, there's no way to put a bow on this conversation other than to say it exceeded all of my expectations, and I'm profoundly grateful to all of you for everything you brought to this exchange tonight. Profoundly grateful to Lisa and Seema for being our partners. Grateful to Marjolaine, who's been running the whole thing behind the scenes. Grateful to all who've spoken or who are listening with rapt attention out in the world. We hope to see you very soon at our next event. Until then, we're wishing you all well, and we hope you'll be safe, and that there was some hope to be found in coming together to face some of these very challenging topics tonight. It's been an absolute honor and a pleasure. And again, the one missing element of the amphitheater is our collective noise. But all you have is those of us on the screen thanking each other and saying goodnight. Thank you all so much.
Night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.